Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the AI for Good Global Summit, always on, all year long. We hope that you, your family, your friends, and your colleagues are all keeping healthy and safe. My name is Fred Werner from the ITU, and it's a privilege for me to introduce today's webinar. Now, the ITU is the United Nations Specialized Agency for Information and Communication Technologies, and we're also the organizers of the AI for Good Global Summit alongside XPRIZE Foundation in partnership with 36 UN sister agencies, ACM, and co-convened by Switzerland. And the goal of the AI for Good Global Summit is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the sustainable development goals and scale those solutions for global impact. And like much of the world, the AI Summit has gone digital, and we're moving forward with weekly programming, allowing us to reach more people than ever before. Now, one of our claims to fame is that we're action-oriented and we're not just a talk shop. And I think today is a perfect example of that. Earlier this year, we created and launched the Global Initiative for AI and Data Commons, which aims to create an enabling platform and infrastructure so that we can scale AI for good problem solving. And today we're launching one of the new projects from the Global Initiative called the Global Data Pledge. Now, before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping issues. First of all, your microphone has been disabled, so please use the Q&A and chat function if you wish to communicate. We'll also be running some live polls, so keep an eye open. And when you see a live poll, please take the time to answer so we can collect your interest. And it's the job of the moderator to identify and ask questions to the panelists. And we're counting on you to have a very interactive session. And speaking of being interactive, I have a first challenge for you. Can you please let us know where you're connecting from? Simply use the chat function and type in what country or city or wherever you're connecting from, and make sure you enable the chat to everyone and not just the panelists. Here, I'll go first. Geneva, Switzerland. India, USA, Montreal, Scotland, Georgia, Washington, D.C., Madagascar, Rome. Wow, this is really, truly a global global audience, and it's actually quite fitting because we're launching a global data pledge. So I think we have the right audience here on hand. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, first speaker, and his name is Richard St. Pierre, and he's the Executive Vice Chairman of C2, and he's also one of the driving forces behind the Global Data Pledge. But first, I'd like to show a quick video. Ginu, please.
Thank you, Frederick, and thank you for the ITU for hosting us today for this session. Welcome, everyone from Tokyo to Mongolia, I just saw, to Montreal, my hometown. And thank you for the time for joining us today. On this call, there's likely not a single person that has not been affected by the pandemic in one way or another. We all know someone that was affected or even lost a dear one. And if that's the case, our hearts goes up to you. There's clearly no going back, but we need to create a new normal, and that new normal does not have to be all negative. That's why we're launching the Global Data Pledge. This is not another competing open data source encryption about storage and privacy laws. It's a pledge. So today, what we would like to do is define what is that Global Data Pledge. So we're going to present to you through our speakers and through our agenda what the pledge is, but also, and more importantly, we like to have your help. We want you to be involved into the definition, the design, the roadmap of that pledge. so that we're not just a me too, but we are an enabler of what already exists. We want to leverage what already exists and be a catalyst for that so it can serve the common good. But before we go to the pledge itself, I'd like to introduce you a few of the speakers that will share the stage with us today. So first of all, illustrious Muhammad Yunus, Nobel Peace Prize laureate. I'll come back to him in a few seconds. Anya Calderon, Executive Director of Open Data Center. Jamie Boyd, Chief Digital Officer of the Government of British Columbia. As you can see, Canadians are well represented here. And I'm joined to co-host this session by Amir Banifatemi, Chair of the Global AI and Data Common Initiative, and also the General Manager of XPRIZE. So our first speaker, Professor Yunus, is joining us directly from Dhaka, Bangladesh. Thank you, Professor, for joining us at such a late hour.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
I think that many people can look at your Wikipedia page for your bio, but your resume cover basically 10 lifetimes. Little known fact is the fact that you have 76 honorary degrees and counting, I think.
Yeah.
And I'm doubtful that anyone on this call can top that. And most leaders of state call upon you for your advice. So that's why we ask you to join today. We would like your advice on a couple of things. So first question, you've assembled a list of very influential people for the world over to declare COVID-19 vaccine a global common good. Considering what we've seen as a fragmented country by country response for this pandemic, you think that some type of data should be also labeled a common good?
Well, there's some data already common good. For example, you mentioned vaccine. Before the vaccine process started, scientists shared information with each other globally. And then starting point is laid down. So these are common good. Nobody's charging for that. Nobody's asking for a particular fee for that. So there's lots of those information available in the open source data. It's many in internet. You go, you have it. So there are lots of it already available. But there are, at the same time, there are lots of information that's locked up. If you just looked at the patent rights all over the world, people don't use it anymore. So at one time it was important, they had their patent, but nobody unpatented them anymore. So they are locked up. And it's a tremendous resource. I said, why are you guarding them that we are not using them? This should be criminal to do that, because somebody can use that information to do something else. So that's what, there is open source, but at the same time, there's a locked up information, locked up data in many, many places. That's what we should be drawing attention to.
That's a good action point. You wrote an article titled "No Going Back," and it made the front page of many newspaper around the world. You currently have like north of 40 million clients right now, so lots of data. What is, in your mind, the key opportunity to gather knowledge from all this without, of course, infringing like privacy laws or privacy rights or anything of the sort? But we all sit on a massive amount of data that you say, like you say, is locked up. What would be kind of an easy path that you would suggest to unlock this potential?
Well, data is knowledge. Data is a vehicle through which you share knowledge. So that knowledge should be shared. This is very simple formula. So this is something that we keep on promoting, that it can be done. But the problem of the data is it's not that all data are not harmless. Some data in the shape of data is a contaminated things. You destroy the whole validity of the data itself. And some are manipulated. You go quietly inside of it and manipulate your minds and so on and so forth. So that's the thing that we have to guard against. What is the right data and what is the wrong data? There are lots of people waiting around to manipulate data. Like in elections, you are talking about, like you're watching television, and then your mind is manipulated. You give out information, fake information, fake data. It's a galore. So these are the trouble for that. And even when the whole world, the whole science of statistics came, it was started by saying lies, damn lies, in statistics. And that's where this all come from. So while data is important, at the same time, we have to be extremely cautious that how to retain the validity of the data, how to retain the purity of data. That because there are so many sources by which they are being manipulated to find a way either to make money or to take some political or security advantage out of it. So this is what we should be guarding against.
Before I turn to the audience to maybe ask a question, and if you want to ask a question to Professor Yunus, just drop it into the chat and we'll pick one for the next question. But I lived what you talk about, manipulation of data, when I was last in Bangladesh with you, where we could see that how the media portrayed the situation really gave a negative spin on something that was very positive, the conference that we were having together. Considering we're talking to have a data pledge, we're not going to say to everyone, keep your data and don't do anything for it because it might be misused. So what are the key things that you think that, what's the message for the critical thing that we should look for to make sure that data is used in the proper and that serves humanity itself?
I thought when you mentioned the data pledge, I thought pledge is a very mild word. It depends on your wish. You want to keep it or you want to break it. Nobody kind of punish you for that. So it should be harsher than that. You see, it should be if you contaminate, if you manipulate, if you distort data, it should be a criminal offense. So then we understand what we are talking about. Pledge is just a nicety. You sign, then you go out, do whatever you want. Nobody is going to punish you. Nobody is going to take care of it. So I would recommend that we get harsher on that, so that it's not something that you play around with life of people, life of the future, life of the planet itself, in manipulating, in twisting, in distorting the data.
I think Paolo follows, one of the audience member follows to what you were saying. Do you think we can go all the way to oblige or made it mandatory that some data be shared? That might not be received very well by many people, from individuals to countries.
Well, I was saying that it's just like the patent right, open source and patent rights kind of thing. So I would say instead of patent right, it should be patent left. Instead of holding it, you turn it around, make it available to everybody. That's the way to proceed. So that's the kind of thing that we should be looking forward. At the same time, guarding the purity of the information, purity of the data. So data is not be locked up in any way for the advantage, for the financial advantage of people. For security, I understand that there's some security issues, something, but beyond that, there is no reason why we have to lock up those information and deprive the humanity to take advantage of it.
I think Angelique from Toronto summarized it well. We should start by a data manifesto of some kind and then move on to more like harsher measure if need be. But that's all the time we have, Professor Yunus. I thank you very much for your time. And I'll now pass it on to Amir for our next speaker. Amir, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Yunus. If you're still with us in a few minutes, we'll probably ask more questions to you. So welcome everyone again, and thank you very much for joining us. And thank you, Richard, for opening the session and welcoming us with Professor Yunus. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Anya Calderon, she is the Executive Director of Open Data Charter, and she supports reformers from around the world to implement open data policies based on shared principles. And she has successfully also delivered the key presidential mandate for open data in Mexico prior to that. And I have a few questions for Anya. But before I ask you that question, Anya, as a context, 4 years ago, we started this whole movement called AI for Good, and it manifested by a series of summits and gatherings. And what we discovered is that access to data is not obviously evident. There are many open data everywhere, and there are private data as well. And when we think about agency of problem solving and giving people that are trying to solve local problems the ability to address those problems, it was not evident. So we started talking about the fact that AI and data should become a common good. How is the right question? We don't know how, but we're trying to make sure that we lean toward the common good, and that starts with basically access to some information and data. So from that perspective, I would like to welcome you and ask you the first questions, because you have been at the origin of this Open Data Charter. Maybe you can tell us more about the Open Data Charter, but also what should be looking at some impact metrics when we talk about open data.
Thank you, Amir. And first, I want to thank the organizers for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today. As mentioned, I head a global organization called the Open Data Charter, whose goal is it's at the heart of the Open Data Charter to make data available to people. It's a collaboration of over 100 governments and expert organizations working to collect, share, and use data to address targeted policy challenges. And we do this by developing practical guidance to open up data in ways that deliver tangible benefits to people. We believe that this can only be achieved by governing data inclusively and accountably. Now, to your question, data has often been presented as a vaccine for the perils of humankind. From revolutionizing sustainable development goals to fueling an equitable pandemic recovery, today it is hard to understand a world without data. And I've always thought of data, I've thought about data as something that can inform better decisions. And this can lead to value in many different ways. For example, if the data that underpins decision-making by people in power is made open, such as from government officials or large corporations, it can sustain a healthier public debate based on a shared reality that is what we ultimately need to improve trust and contribute to a well-functioning democratic system. But opening data in ways that make it accessible, comparable, and timely, which are principles of the Open Data Charter, can, for example, in our current context, allow people to know where to go to buy masks and how much stock is available, such as is the case in Taiwan, find your nearest COVID-19 testing center, such as here in the UK, or help health authorities mitigate the spread of the disease using mobility data that has been released by companies such as Google and Apple. But much like a vaccine, placing good quality data in the hands of people that need it requires a governance process that aims to maximize access to benefits while reducing unwelcome side effects. As has been mentioned before, I think what we are seeing is that it is as important for the process to be rooted in principles of openness as much as the data that is being made available through it. So this means transparent and honest communication about the data that's being published, how it is structured, who made those decisions, and what limitations do we need to be aware of. We also need to do more in terms of explaining how sensitive and personal information is being safeguarded, publishing any privacy or other risk impact assessment in timely ways. It is very much about a process that meaningfully allows those that may be affected or watchdog organizations the ability to scrutinize, to raise concerns, and to encourage people to engage with that data in order to create value.
It was very insightful. As we talk about value, we're trying to capture value today from the SDGs perspective to Sustainable Development Goals as a framework to evaluate problems and problems that need to be solved. if you think about problems as the recipient of data, and we had this conversation together before, how do you think that more open data and data sharing would make sense if we knew in advance what problems we needed to be solving?
Yes, I think this is a very important question, because for any data initiative, context really matters. We don't treat health data the same way as we do transport data or data from the judiciary system, for example. At the Open Data Charter, we advocate for this by calling for governments to publish with purpose. And this is because there are always different levels of risk involved. Those that are deemed low risk should perhaps be open by default, while others require more degrees of safeguarding. People may feel comfortable with certain types of data to be shared for certain purposes and not others. And in cases that involve data about, for example, those people in position of powers, expenses of EU commissioners or other public officials, there are laws that require that information to be made available in order to redress that power. And fundamentally, this is important because as humans, we experience the world through problems and not through data. In other words, you first need to clearly articulate a problem that resonates to people, and then we can figure out what and how can data be used to make a difference in their lives. Now, I think it's important to note a recent report in Nature that points to a common focus from our industry, the AI and tech industry, to ask whether their tools are fair or for good. And there have further claims that these are tend to be infinite spacious words, pushing us instead to be asking questions like, how is data, or in this case, well, the article focuses on AI, but in this case, we can ask ourselves how data is shifting power. So it calls for putting marginalized and impact communities at the center of design, development, and governance of these processes. Along with thinking about problems, I think it's also critical to position those problems as part of a political economy that acknowledges power imbalances, especially as the pandemic, surveillance, and data gathering efforts are accelerating the risks of equity implications that may potentially be hard to roll back. So finally, with the World Health Organization now calling for rapid data sharing as the basis for public health action, we really need to ask ourselves, how can this tilt the playing field to benefit those that are most likely to be impacted or incriminated against?
I love your positioning on the vulnerable communities. Can we say now that we need more open data today than any other time? Is it a crisis, a revealing factor for more open data, or do you think that open data should be more weaved into the fabric of our society and governance and policy making, and crisis should not be affecting that?
I definitely am a believer of crisis bringing a chance for opportunity. So I think it's also very particular world we're living. We're experiencing a global collision of crises caused by coronavirus, the aftermath of recession, looming climate emergency. On one hand, we see how crucial it has been to open and share data in order to help us navigate this pandemic, from sharing scientific discoveries, tracking the spread of disease, health sector capacity, to informing policies and reforms that aim to address the fault lines that have been exposed in our political and social balance. Most visibly, I think the lack of protection for the poorest, or racial divides, or investments in, or lack of investment in healthcare systems. But what has also been exposed is a very fragmented data ecosystem that makes collaboration extremely difficult. And the global nature of this problem and these crises require joined up action. So in our efforts to map, we're currently mapping types of data that different countries are making available. We have seen massive inconsistencies in how data is collected, defined, and aggregated, resulting in attributes that can't be compared and leaving some significant gaps. For example, in efforts to capture age, race, ethnicity, and location, that are very important, demographic data, we need to understand the impacts of the pandemic. Some countries have disaggregated data to dangerous levels, and others are showing very good and innovative data management practices. So Hungary, for example, published a list of coronavirus deaths to the level that allowed deceased to be re-identified, including very sensitive information about them, which violates their privacy. While, for example, in New Zealand, we saw carefully managed and dynamic data practices that waited until the number of cases was large enough before they started disaggregating information in safe ways. At first, not releasing details such as age, then including age brackets, and later age numbers. So as more countries are starting to include this level of detail, there's still a stark lack of standardization. Just take the same example of age bands and how it differs across countries. Some use ranges from 30 to 39, others 35 to 44, etc. It makes it very hard to compare these numbers. So an increasingly polarized and challenging geopolitical world that we are living today, I believe that opening and sharing data across borders in ways that are enhancing collaboration efforts is a vital step that we need to take in order to make progress together.
Thank you so much, Anya. There are a few questions. I think some of them are for you in the Q&A. I'll let you look at them. I'm going to go to Jamie. I'm going to come back to you. So I would like to introduce Jamie Boyd. I'm very pleased to have Jamie with us today. She serves as the Chief Digital Officer of the Government of British Columbia and Canada, and she does lead efforts to embrace digital change, helping governments serve citizens using modern technology, and she's a big advocate of government transparency, accountability, and the common good. Jamie, welcome, and we're so happy to have you. And we heard the answers from Professor Yunus and also Anya Calderon. You have been talking a lot about investing in open data. And then maybe you can explain a bit more what you mean by investing in open data, and how would you translate a pledge of data as an investment?
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be joining you today from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people on the west coast of Canada. This is such an important and exciting topic to be discussing with you all. I have spoken at length about the value of investing in open data, and I think that that's the right characterization, because open data is not just a thing that happens. Releasing and using data is never neutral. And it's very expensive. It's very intensive in terms of labor and whatnot. And I think that that's a really important frame to bring to these kinds of conversations. Sometimes we think of data as something that just flows around us and is just available for us to pluck out of the sky. It really isn't. It can be extremely challenging and costly to manage these things appropriately, thoughtfully, and in a way that is really citizen-driven or human-driven. So the perspective that I bring to this is one that's very much from the public sector. I've spent a number of years working in government. And for us, our guiding north, the reason governments exist is to serve people. Data is a powerful enabler for that kind of citizen-driven service. Given that, it would seem to me really useful to frame data collection and use as being something that can and should be human-centered. At the same time, balancing the imperative of leveraging data for service delivery with all of the costs that come with it is, it can be challenging. The kinds of things that, in my mind, make it somewhat costly to effectively manage and use data are that, well, it's a question of availability. So often, large organizations like my own will collect data, and we do need to be somewhat nuanced in the way that we triage the kind of data that it would be a candidate for release. So as Anya quite rightly said, we need to be thoughtful and publish with purpose, right? It's not reasonable or realistic for large organizations to simply put all content out without any thought to the availability, the findability, the extent to which it conforms to data standards and whatnot. I think that in the brave new world of the fourth industrial revolution and dramatic innovations, it's also important to think about the way that data flows. So not just putting out a data set and saying, okay, we're transparent now, right? You can't have a one-time investment. These things have to be refreshed. They have to be maintained. You have to be constantly assessing the data that you make available with that's available from third parties, because we do have the risk of re-identification. And many of us are guided by robust privacy frameworks, and for good reason. So in that kind of an environment, we need to be thinking about the availability of the data, the accessibility of the data. Are people going to be able to find it? Just because you released it as an organization doesn't mean that the person who needs to be using that data is going to be able to find it. And can they use it? The time and the hours and frankly, the lifetimes that we've spent cleaning data is not great value, right? And so we need to be aligning with established data standards. And finally, we need to be thinking about lifecycle management. So not just spitting out that data one time and declaring victory, but really having this ongoing dynamic. So yeah, I would say it's an investment. It's an important one though.
So if we talk about a data pledge, in the world of investment, when we think about the investment, we also nurture that investment. We just don't invest. We try to accompany, try to make room for it, give them a chance to succeed and to grow. So if a data pledge into open data or in general open pledge is an investment, who are going to be the investors? Are we talking about just organizations that are government, NGOs organization? Who can pledge data? Who are is my little nonprofit in Kuala Lumpur can be giving a pledge, or should be a big government? Who are the best candidates to pledge data?
That's a great question. And I mean, I'm almost going to cop out of this one because it seems to me that we do need to be taking an ecosystem approach. So the data owners, regardless of where they are in the ecosystem, really should be thinking about whether the data is going to contribute to common good, and if it's going to be able to nurture these kinds of ecosystems. I think we do need to recognize that there are lots of reasons why organizations might not want to default to opening all of their data. So the privacy considerations that I identified earlier, many organizations are looking at, you know, their competitive advantage being driven by some kind of, by the data they manage. And those are important considerations. At the same time, a lot of very data-rich organizations can nurture ecosystems and build innovation around themselves by considering things like releasing data aggregates. So releasing a portion of the data in a way that would inspire innovation or enable other service providers to build on top of the data offerings, while also respecting privacy or, you know, competitive dynamics, whatever they might be. In the public sector, of course, we also have security considerations and all that sort of thing. So I would really say the entire ecosystem. Increasingly, organizations that are not governments are becoming very data rich. I think that when some of us got involved in the open data movement, certainly from the public sector, in my case, we were sitting on massive amounts of data in government, and it was a question of going out, finding that data, cleaning it up and releasing it. And we were able to make very significant progress, in my case, within the Government of Canada. Increasingly though, the kinds of data that are available from private sector organizations are going to be significant. Just super anecdotal, but I think it's helpful. You think of road network data. Who would be the best provider of road network data? Well, you sort of instinctually, you would say government. Makes sense. But now with the fleet that would be managed by an entity like Uber or Lyft, real-time data for road networks is going to be available through that kind of a data source, right? And so if you have sort of trusted sources of truth coming in from the public sector, you can then take cross-sector approaches working between sectors to be very effective. I started my remarks by saying that data is not neutral. So I would also argue that a really important set of players in this ecosystem would be academia, the not-for-profit sector, and then whoever it is that is releasing this data, managing it, ensuring that we are supporting inclusion and effective service delivery. There is going to be an ongoing need for capacity building because, again, the data that many of us have the privilege of working with does have fairly intimate implications for people's well-being.
I'd like to come back to a question to you and both Anya about, you mentioned the concept of common good. And once we launched this past January, the Global Initiative on AI and Data for the Common Good, the notion of common good is not an obvious one, because we all care about a common good, but when it becomes a public utility and usage, it has to be available and sustainable to remain a common good. So as we talk about open data, do you believe that a pledge of some sort could be a starting point to engage into the understanding that the common good needs to exist?
Go ahead, Anya.
Thank you, Jamie. I think thinking about that objective is going to be very important for what success looks like for a global data pledge, because you can only achieve data for the commons if it's developed by the commons, not just for the commons. So I think thinking about, what are communities and individuals that data is intended to serve. I mean, what we discussed before, clearly articulating that purpose and those problems that you're seeking to find solutions towards. It's about involving people in that process of understanding, what levels of openness are they comfortable with in terms of sharing that data for those purposes, and also making it about a continuous process, because as you're making data available, and Jamie well knows this, data is never perfect. It's about a continuous improvement process. Once you start using that data, you will understand how it can be improved. But also the world change, norms change, people's beliefs and values may change over time, and we need to continue to bring them in the data journey and governance process to make sure that it is serving that common purpose.
Jamie?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. How do we make sure that data lives up to its promise? And I think that the answer, a good answer to this, is one that really looks at data as being the lifeblood of so much of the service delivery that we have across sectors in a digital world. So I again have the pleasure of working in a government that is very focused on providing excellent services to the people of British Columbia. And we talk about best practices in service delivery. And I think that those best practices in developing digital services are best practices that also apply to the management of data and making it available. So those best practices are things like being agile, human-centered, and open. So when we talk about being agile in software development, it's really about iterating, about setting an objective, taking a few steps towards it, learning as we go. And there are lots of different strategies for doing that in the data space. So, making, for example, available the whole suite of data that might be candidates for release, and then working with communities to understand what would be highest value. This is something that we've seen in our movement, in the open data movement over the past few years, and we've learned a lot. We've learned, for example, that the data standards that we had for gender were not appropriate. And we learned that we had to adopt non-binary data standards. We've learned as we go, because we work with communities, and the communities tell us when the data that we are providing is or isn't appropriate. We can be human-centered. So for us in software development, that means watching people interact with the services, understanding their journey through the kind of problem space that we're trying to address. That's a similar kind of thing that we can lend to the data space, inviting the people who are going to make use of the data to explain what the use case is, and really living the ethos of publishing with purpose. And finally, we can be open. So really defaulting to open standards. We in British Columbia, we're, to the extent possible, an open source government. We like to work with communities because it makes things better. We're able to develop those robust ecosystems. We're able to collaborate, and ultimately that leads to better services. I think that too often in our data-driven society, we feel like data is a thing that happens to us. And I would argue that there's a real opportunity right now for us as citizens of the world to come together and say, no, we are our own data owners. We believe in things like self-sovereign identity. We believe in our ability to actually manage our own data and have a view, a sophisticated view on who should and shouldn't be accessing that data or making use of it. So it seems to me that we need to drive ourselves to a point where this vision of citizen-centered or human-centered data is no longer revolutionary, because today it's a little bit too revolutionary.
Wonderful, thank you. We will, if we have time, we get to more questions. There are many questions out there, but these are the principles that are driving us all together as a community. And while there are a set of principles, like Open Data Charter has created principles where there are European unions have a number of research, where many governments like yours, British Columbia government, has already adopted a set of standards and principles and guidance. And there are numerous think tanks and research organizations that are alerting us about privacy, safety, security, bias, and so forth. How can we incentivize more data sharing and incentivize more responsible, right, pledge and investment of data for the common good? So that's the goal of this pledge that we're trying to start with. And Richard is going to be explaining how we're planning to do this. See if you can have the next slide, and we'll come back to you. So the goal of the Global Data Pledge is basically saying that, of course, it is our collective mission to find ways to identify and manage and distribute data in order to respond to all crises, whether this is this pandemic or hunger or poverty or gender inequality. There are multiple crises around us that come and go in importance. And the goal for us is to propose an international pledge on global data resources. We're not trying to recreate all the effort that already exists. There are charters. The presence of Ania here is a proof of that, is that we're going to be relying on those existing charters and set of principles. But how can we incentivize, now that we have those principles, how can we incentivize for more data sharing, more data pledges, so we can learn more, we can share more, we can collectively solve problems together more. And in order to do that, we're trying to announce this at the AI for Good Summit in September. But in the meantime, we'll try to create 2 working groups, and Richard will explain them shortly on how we can, I'll let you, Richard, go to that, how we can design a playbook of data pledge, and how we can increase collaboration between all the parties and scaling up right access to data. Richard, up to you.
And me, we thought that data was old news. We've been talking about it for like decades, and here we are, it's still center stage. So data is the crux of what we need to do. I loved when Anya Calderon says we need to have define the problem that resonates with people. And so the 2 work groups that we're initiating are exactly for that. So it's not going to come out of my head alone, Amir's head alone, Jamie's head alone. It's the collective that needs to define the framework to address those 2 questions that you have there on your screen. So there's many ways to skin a cat, but these are the first initial steps that we need to take in order to create kind of a reference point in order to move forward. So the two work groups that we are planning are, first, data pledge playbook design, and the second one, collaboration and scaling. And be ready, you in the audience, we're going to be asking for your help on both. So let's go to the first data pledge playbook design. So first, it's a pledge, but what does a pledge look like? And we heard from Muhammad Yunus that he wanted to be more incisive than pledge. Let's see how we can make it, or what is the first step that needs to take it. But let's be clear, it's not a storage approach. It's not about encryption, and it's not about a new redefining privacy laws. Of course, we need to address those, but we need first and foremost to understand what is out there and under which conditions these will be pledged. So we're talking here about a framing document. And we're also talking about under which standard, which protocol it would be shared, and so on. So these are the key elements of what we would like to have as the data pledge playbook design. And ultimately, as Amir was saying, by end of September, we would like to have the first result of that definition, to be able to come back to all of you with your collaboration and say, what does that look like? So I'm going to ask the first question. Do you want to be part of that work group? And you're going to have a pop-up on your screen right now. And if you want to be so, click on yes. If not, click on no. And even if you want to be one of the leaders of this group, click on the button as such. So tick tock, 15 seconds. Please answer the question. And as you're answering the question, we will be reaching out to you by email in the coming days in order to draw up the plan and the roadmap between now and September. Okay, I think that was enough time for just one click. So we'll move on to work group 2. So work group 2, we've labeled collaboration and scaling. So our goal, and we've said it multiple times, is not about reinventing the wheel. So we have to figure out the activities that will enhance and amplify what already exists. How can we act as a catalyst to what's already there? There's more than 1,600 initiatives worldwide, from open data to other standards. How do we make sure that worldwide we have a global footprint? And it also means inclusiveness here. It's not just about the US, France, Germany. We saw that some people are from Iran on this group. So we want to be very inclusive and include a lot of countries. So please answer the question as to collaboration and scaling. Do you want to be part of the work group or not? Again, I think that was ample time for people to just do a single click. I thank you very much. I look forward to reaching out to you over the coming days. Look at my email address over here if you want to exchange in the meantime. If you were unsure about your position on that, I'll be happy to exchange with you. In the meantime, I'll pass it on again to Amir to show and tell us a bit about next steps.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I hope these two groups were simple enough. We tried hard to be really basic in the approach and not make sure we recreate the world again. So as Richard said, we're going to be reaching out to all volunteers that want to join us in these working groups. They're going to be short-lived. The goal for us is to have a first design workshop as soon as next week. And then during the AI for Good Summit, which is from September 21st to 30th, we'll have probably one or multiple reports out during that time about what happened, what we learned, and how we can actually start a pledge. And this is an important time. I think pandemic has shown that we can get together, we can come together, we can work together. And it's probably also time, as both Jamie and Anya said, that the narrative of data is known. We're not learning something new, but the way we act and participate, I think, should be reminded on a constant basis. And we want to have this pledge as a signification that we care, and we want to basically give all the problem solvers or the problem owners a fuel, right? An engine to connect them, and data is one of them. That's not enough. We need many more. We need governance. We need many of other ingredients, but this is an important one. If time allows, and we'll thank you all for participation and coming. We're very excited, and we reach out to every one of you. If we still have time, there are a number of questions, and if Anya and Jamie are willing to, you can select the questions that you want to answer and answer them directly live on this panel. I can read them to you if you want to, or you can select the one that you think you want to answer. You can answer now, because some of them require a longer answer.
Sure. In the interest of keeping the conversation going, there are two questions that really jump out at me as being really quite fascinating. So one is around the connection between data and AI. And I think that that's a great question. And then the other one is sort of is there scope for us to be obliging data owners to open up data? So I think these are both fascinating questions. So I'll start with the second one. I don't know that that's the best approach to necessarily oblige. There are some organizations, some governments that certainly have looked at legislating, or at least legislating elements of their open data approach. So there are, for example, the legal framework that came into effect in the United States last year does look at having a legislative requirement around data stewardship